I was already 10 minutes late when I saw him fall. The sidewalk outside the Meridian Hotel was crowded with people in evening wear, women in heels, men in tuxedos, valets jogging between idling black cars. Everyone was moving in the same direction, flowing toward the entrance like water finding a drain. And right in the middle of all of it, an elderly man stepped off the curb, reached for a parking meter to steady himself, and missed. I heard the sound before I fully processed what was happening. A sharp crack of a knee hitting concrete. A small grunt of pain, muffled and dignified, like he was trying not to make a fuss. And then he was just there on the ground, one hand pressed flat against the sidewalk, the other clutching the meter he hadn't managed to grab in time. Nobody stopped. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I mean it literally. The crowd parted around him the way water parts around a rock, and people kept walking. A woman in a red gown actually stepped over his outstretched hand without looking down. I had a gala to get to. My boyfriend's family had been planning this charity event for 6 months, and his mother had made it very clear that punctuality was, in her words, the first impression you never get back. I had my dress on, my hair done, a gift bag in one hand, and my phone already buzzing with a text from my boyfriend asking where I was. I stopped anyway. "Sir, hey, are you okay?" I crouched down next to him, setting my gift bag on the ground. Up close, I could see he was older than I'd first thought, maybe mid-80s, with neat white hair and a dark blazer that had a small American flag pin on the lapel. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "I'm fine," he said immediately, which was almost certainly not true. "You're bleeding." There was a thin line of red visible through his torn pants, just below his right knee. "Not serious, but real. Can you put weight on it?" He tried. He couldn't. I stayed with him. I flagged down a passing hotel employee, helped get the man who told me his name was Gerald to a chair inside the lobby, found a first aid kit, and sat with him while someone called his granddaughter. He kept apologizing for the inconvenience. I kept telling him there was no inconvenience. My phone buzzed 4 more times while I was sitting there. By the time I walked into the Meridian Gala, I was 32 minutes late and my gift bag had a scuff on the corner from where I'd set it on the pavement. The ballroom was already in full swing, round tables draped in ivory linen, a live string quartet in the corner, and more money in one room than I would earn in the next decade. I spotted my boyfriend across the room. We had been together for 2 years. He was 34, handsome in a rehearsed way, and came from a family whose name was on 2 buildings in this city. He had told me early on that his parents were particular and that I shouldn't take it personally if they seemed reserved at first. I had told myself that was fine. I was a nurse. I dealt with difficult situations for a living. Surely I could handle one dinner. This was not our first time meeting, but it was the first time I had been invited to a family event, the annual gala for his family's foundation, the one that mattered, the one where, as he'd put it, everyone who's anyone in this family shows up. I understood what that meant. I was being evaluated. He crossed the room toward me, and the first thing he said was, "You're late." "I know. I'm sorry." There was a man outside who fell. He was hurt. I couldn't just. "Claire." He said my name the way you'd say the word enough. Quiet. Final. My mother already noticed. I followed him to the family table. His mother was the kind of woman who had perfected the art of the cutting remark wrapped in a compliment. She greeted me with a warm smile and said, "Oh, Claire, you made it." We were starting to worry something had happened. Then she turned to the woman beside her and said, just loud enough, "She's a nurse, you know. Their schedules can be so unpredictable." His father barely looked up from his conversation. His sister, to her credit, gave me an actual smile. But she was seated at the far end of the table. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I told myself to breathe. The questions started with the appetizers. "Claire, remind me, you work at which hospital?" his mother asked. "St. Augustine's." "I'm in the cardiac ICU." "How interesting." She said it the way people say how unusual. "And you've been doing that for how long now?" "5 years. A small sip of wine. My cousin's daughter just finished her residency. Cardiology. The hours these doctors keep, I don't know how they do it." A pause, precisely timed. Of course, nursing is its own kind of dedication. I smiled. It really is. Do you see yourself staying in nursing? Or is there a plan for something more ambitious? I felt my boyfriend's hand on the table beside mine, but he didn't reach for it. I love what I do, I said. I'm actually pursuing a certification in advanced cardiac care. There's a lot of room to grow. Of course. Another smile. It's just with the cost of living in this city, one wonders about the practicalities. Do you own or rent? I rent. For now. Sensible, she said, in a tone that made it sound like the opposite. The dinner went on. Each course brought a new variation on the same theme: my salary, my education, my apartment, my family. My mother, who raised me and my sister alone after our father left when I was 9, was described by his mother as resilient, in a tone that made resilience sound like a consolation prize. At one point, his father turned to me directly and asked, "What did your father do?" "He wasn't in the picture," I said. A beat of silence. His father nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. My boyfriend said nothing. That was the part I kept coming back to, even then, sitting at that table in my nicest dress. Not the questions. Not his mother's careful smile or his father's pointed curiosity. It was the silence beside me. Every time a comment landed with a little more edge than it needed to, I waited. I waited for him to change the subject, to squeeze my hand, to say something, anything that acknowledged I was a person and not a specimen. He never did. After dinner, during the part of the evening where people circulated and made donations and pretended the whole thing was effortless, I slipped away to a quieter corner of the ballroom. I needed 2 minutes and a glass of water, and to remember that I was good at my job and that I mattered, and that the opinion of a woman who had never worked a day in her life did not define me. My phone buzzed. It was my sister. I stepped into the hallway to take the call, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was trying to hold it together. I could hear it, that particular steadiness people use when they're terrified. "It's Mom," she said. She collapsed at work. They took her in an ambulance. "Claire, they think it's her heart." I don't remember walking back through the ballroom. I remember finding my boyfriend, and I remember the look on his face when I told him not alarm, not warmth, but something that looked like inconvenience. "Tonight?" he said. "Yes, tonight. My mother is in the emergency room. Claire, the benefit is almost over. Can your sister handle it? She's an adult." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the times I had made myself smaller for him. All the times I had told myself that particular was just a word for people who needed time to warm up. All the times I had waited for him to choose me, even in small ways, and been quietly disappointed. "I have to go," I said. "If you leave now, my mother is going to." I have to go. I picked up my coat from the coat check. I walked out the front entrance of the Meridian Hotel, back onto the same sidewalk where, 2 hours earlier, I had knelt next to an old man who'd fallen. The valet traffic had thinned. The crowd was mostly gone. I was standing at the curb waiting for a rideshare when I heard someone say my name. I turned around. A young woman, maybe 25, dark coat, and expression caught somewhere between surprise and recognition, was walking toward me from the hotel entrance. "You're Claire," she said. "You helped my grandfather tonight." Outside, before the gala. I blinked. "Gerald is your grandfather?" "He is." She smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm smile I'd encountered all evening. "I'm Diane." He called me from inside, told me some young woman in a blue dress stopped and stayed with him when everyone else walked by. "He said you were kind." She paused. "He wanted me to find you tonight and say thank you in person, but I had to park the car, and by the time I got inside, she gestured at the hotel behind us. "Are you okay? You look like you've had a night." I laughed, which surprised me. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly, but it was real. "My mom's in the hospital." I was just leaving. Her expression shifted immediately. "Which hospital?" "Street Augustine's." "That's actually where I work, so." "Street Augustine's." She said it slowly. That's my grandfather is on the board there. Has been for 15 years. She must have seen something in my face, because she added quickly, not trying to make it weird. If there's anything he can do, he would want to. He's that kind of person. I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked her, gave her my number because she asked, and got into my car. My mother had suffered what the ER doctor described as a hypertensive emergency. Her blood pressure had spiked to a dangerous level, likely brought on by stress, and a medication she'd let lapse because she'd been quietly rationing her prescription to save money. She was stable by the time I arrived, pale and small against the hospital pillows, apologizing the way she always did when anything happened to her that required someone else's attention. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Mom, you had your dinner." "Mom." She looked at me for a moment, and then something in her face softened. "How was it?" "Exactly what I expected," I said. Which was true, and we both understood what that meant. I sat with her for 4 hours. My sister fell asleep in the chair by the window. I held my mother's hand and listened to her breathe and thought about the fact that she had worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood and never once asked anyone for anything, and that some woman across town was probably at this moment saying something politely cutting about resilience. My boyfriend texted at midnight. The message said, "My mother is very disappointed. We should talk." I turned my phone face down and watched the monitor above my mother's bed. 3 days later, my mother was discharged with a new care plan, a prescription she could actually afford thanks to a patient advocate at the hospital who helped her apply for assistance, and instructions to reduce stress. The doctor who oversaw her care was thorough and kind and explained everything twice without being asked. On my way out of the hospital that afternoon, I ran into Diane in the lobby. I almost didn't recognize her out of context. She was standing near the information desk, holding 2 coffee cups, dressed more casually than she had been at the gala. She saw me the same moment I saw her. "I was actually hoping I might run into you," she said, which seemed unlikely enough that I raised an eyebrow. She laughed. "Okay, my grandfather asked me to check in. He asked the charge nurse which days you worked, and I waited in the lobby for 2 hours. That sounds worse than it is." "It sounds like something," I agreed. She handed me one of the coffees. "My grandfather wants to meet you properly. Not in a weird way, he's 83, I promise his motives are completely wholesome. When someone does something kind for him, he doesn't forget it. He's been talking about you since the night of the gala." I thought about Gerald, his shaking hands, his careful dignity, the way he'd apologized for the inconvenience of his own injury. "I'd like that," I said. We met the following Saturday at a quiet restaurant near the waterfront. Gerald was already seated when Diane and I arrived, wearing a cardigan and the same American flag pin, looking considerably steadier than the last time I'd seen him. He stood when we approached the table, which made me feel immediately like I should have dressed better. "There she is," he said, and the warmth in it was so uncomplicated and genuine that it caught me off guard. Sit down. I've been looking forward to this all week." We talked for almost 3 hours. Gerald had built a small logistics company over 40 years, sold it at 70, and spent the last 13 years doing what he called the real work, the hospital board, a scholarship fund he'd started in his late wife's name. A mentorship program for first-generation college students. He asked about my work with the kind of attention that made it clear he was actually listening, not just being polite. At some point, he asked how my mother was recovering. I told him she was doing better, but that the experience had shaken me more than I'd admitted to anyone, that she'd been rationing her medication, that I hadn't known. That I was her daughter and I worked in a cardiac unit and I hadn't known. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "You couldn't have known, because she was protecting you. That's what mothers do. The question is what you do with it now that you do know." I didn't have an answer to that. But I thought about it for weeks afterward. 2 months after the gala, my boyfriend and I ended things. It wasn't dramatic. It was actually very quiet, a conversation at his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, a lot of things said carefully and a few things said honestly, and then it was done. He said I had different priorities than his family expected. I said that was probably true. We shook hands, which is a strange thing to do, but felt right. His mother sent me a card. It said she wished me well. I believed she meant it, in her way. Around the same time, Gerald mentioned to me that his foundation's scholarship fund, the one named for his wife, Eleanor, had an open seat on the selection committee, and that he thought I might bring a perspective they were missing. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a question, asked over coffee, by an old man who paid attention. I said yes. I've been on that committee for 8 months now. Last spring, we awarded 11 scholarships to nursing and allied health students, most of them first generation, most of them from backgrounds that looked a lot like mine. At the ceremony, Gerald sat in the front row and cried a little during the third recipient's speech, and when I looked over at him, he just shook his head and smiled like he was embarrassed and also completely at peace. I think about that night on the sidewalk sometimes. About the way the crowd parted around him and kept moving. About the fact that being 32 minutes late to the most important dinner of my relationship turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made, not because of what came after, not because of the board seat or the committee or any of it, but because in that moment I was just a person who saw another person on the ground and didn't walk past. My mother asked me once if I regretted leaving the gala early. I told her the truth. The only thing I regret is that it took me that long to realize I'd been waiting for someone to choose me in a room full of people who had already made up their minds. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, at least you figured it out. She's doing well now. She takes her medication on time. She calls me every Sunday. Sometimes she asks about Gerald, who she has met exactly once, and already treats like a beloved elderly uncle. Last week, I started a new certification program, Advanced Cardiac Care, the one I'd mentioned at that dinner table, while someone across from me smiled tightly and asked about my rent. I study in the mornings before my shifts, and some evenings. Diane and I get coffee, and she helps me quiz for the practice exams because she has, somehow, become one of my closest friends, which is not something I would have predicted from a sidewalk outside a hotel. Life is strange that way. You think you're running towards something, the right dinner, the right family, the right version of yourself that will finally be enough for the people you're trying to impress, and then you stop for 5 minutes to help a stranger. And it turns out that was the door the whole time. You just have to be willing to be late. I used to think that doing the right thing in the wrong moment was still a mistake. That timing mattered more than intention. That showing up late to the things that were supposed to matter, even for a good reason, would cost you more than you could afford to lose. I don't believe that anymore. What happened to me taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. The choices that define us are rarely the ones we make when everything is easy and the room is watching. They're the ones we make when we're already running late, when nobody would notice if we kept walking, when stopping costs us something real. That's where character actually lives, not in the grand gestures, but in the 5-minute decisions on a crowded sidewalk when a stranger falls and the whole world keeps moving. I stopped for Gerald because it was the right thing to do. Not because I expected anything in return. Not because I calculated the odds. I stopped because I was raised by a woman who worked 2 jobs and never walked past someone who needed help, and somewhere along the way that became the truest part of who I am. The intelligence I'm most proud of isn't the kind you earn in a certification program, it's the kind that recognizes another human being's dignity and responds to it without hesitation. But here's what I've come to understand about the way actions ripple outward. When you lead with genuine decency, you create conditions for genuine connection, not always, not on a schedule. But over time, the people you are honest and kind with tend to be honest and kind back. Gerald didn't offer to help me because I earned it, or because he owed me anything. He did it because one small act of care told him something true about who I was, and he was the kind of person who paid attention to that. What came after wasn't luck. It was the natural result of 2 people who actually showed up for each other, even as strangers, even in the most ordinary of circumstances. And the relationship I walked away from that wasn't a loss. That was clarity. I had spent 2 years waiting for someone to choose me out loud, in front of people, when it counted. The gala was just the night I finally stopped waiting. There is a particular kind of strength that comes not from fighting for your place at a table, but from recognizing when the table was never meant for you and having the courage to stand up and leave without anger, without bitterness, just with the quiet knowledge that you deserve more than silence from the person beside you. That's the thing about self-respect. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly determines which rooms you're willing to stay in. My mother as well. I am working towards something that matters. I have friendships now that feel like solid ground. None of it came from impressing the right people or saying the right things at the right dinner. It came from a moment of stopping from being willing to be late, to kneel on a sidewalk, to choose a stranger's dignity over my own convenience. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: the version of yourself you are when nobody is watching, when there is nothing to gain. When stopping will cost you something that is your truest self. Protect her, let her make the call. She knows more than you think she does.